Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Cafe Muse's November 2023 reading. It's great to see so many faces that I know and some new ones too. Tonight, my co-host, Henry Crawford, and I are delighted to introduce two exceptional poets, David Keplinger and Dorianne Laux. Henry will introduce David, and I will introduce Dorianne. If time permits, Karen Alanier will host a brief Q&A. We enthusiastically encourage you to buy the poets' books. We'll put links to purchase them in the chat. We'll also put a link in the chat to donate to Cafe Muse to help continue these evenings of excellent poetry. We're a nonprofit and produced by an all-volunteer staff. If you have difficulty hearing the poets, click on the gray box at the bottom of the toolbar labeled CC, then click on Show Subtitles, and the words will magically appear at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to use the chat function to comment throughout the readings. I see some of you are already doing that. That's great. We've muted your microphones to ensure uninterrupted readings. I'm turning the microphone over to Henry to introduce our first poet.
Okay, David Keplinger arrives with us tonight on these multiple squares that are not unlike his multi-layered poetry that weaves science and spirituality, language, and the world beyond language, balancing the locus of our ordinary joys with a vision that is both extraordinary and yet incomparably immediate and accessible. He arrives here, the poet-teacher of so many of us, gifted in the nuanced art of addressing the deepest concerns of his students while simultaneously giving structure to form and honoring the wild heart that speaks in all of us. Oh, yes. David Keplinger arrives with poems that wander off into the smallest eddies of consciousness, only to come zinging back to crack our minds with the sharpness and clarity of a Zen master's strike. Whether serving as an archaeologist of the human soul, digging deeply back into our past, as in his latest work, Ice, or rediscovering the body in all its damp glory in his beautiful collection, The Most Natural Thing, Keplinger gives us poetry that shows us more, takes us to more places to invent, invert, collapse, and recollapse our understanding of the experience of being alive. David Keplinger is the author of 8 collections of poetry, most recently Ice in 2023, and The World to Come in 2021. He is the winner of the 2021 Minds on Fire Prize. His book, Another City, was awarded the Rilke Prize. He has won the Emily Dickinson Award from the Poetry Society of America, and his work with Danish poet Carsten Renee Nielsen, 41 Objects, was the finalist for the National Translation Award. He teaches at American University. As a poet, teacher, and friend, David Keplinger arrives in our troubled world at a troubled time to show us the inherent beauty in things exactly as they are. He'll be there guiding a meditation session or a poetry workshop, or you can just pick up any one of his several collections, and there he is, the magical professor teaching lessons of the mind and giving seminars on the possibilities to be found within the human heart. So I will not go on any further. Instead, let's celebrate David Keplinger arriving here tonight in Zoom at Cafe Muse online. David, have at it.
Henry, thank you. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. You are my brother. Thank you so much for inviting me tonight and for this chance to read with Dorianne, whose work has inspired me since I was a graduate student in the early 90s. So Dorianne, thank you for sharing the stage with me. As Henry said, there have been a few books in the last 10 years, especially. I've been interested in bodies, most recently frozen bodies that emerge, and emergent bodies of all sorts. And on just this Friday, I was giving a talk on Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays, and remembering poems of my own, which were responses to these kinds of moments where we imagine our parents in spaces that we'll never know. We imagine ourselves into those spaces and think about what was really going on there. What did I know? What did I know? So this first poem actually goes back 20 years. It's called Side Work, and it's a poem about my father after his second shift work on a cold winter night, warming up the truck. So I thought I'd start with this one. Side Work. Great things begin in the periphery. Meanwhile, my father works third shift at the mustard plant. He's around my age. He's finished for the night. He revs the truck, waiting for the heat. The ladder shakes in its rack on top. The heat is dusty coming on. All this can happen without us, just out of view. It's almost morning. The smallest tools begin to shudder now in their boxes. And I look back on that poem, even though it doesn't sound like Hayden's poem, it really is a response to that what did I know moment. All of those hours that my father spent by himself, just revving up the truck and on his way to work and on his way back to work and checking in on me just as I was falling asleep, or just before I got up in the morning. And I also think about this poem as a kind of precursor to everything else I was about to write, because it's got all the stuff in it, like boxes and ice, containers of all sorts. So this next poem, somebody asked me to read today because I was on Zoom this morning with somebody doing a podcast, and behind me was a window into my yard. And as I was reading poems, two deer walked up to the window and gazed in. And this is something that has happened before with Majda Gama, a reading that we gave in the garden up in Baltimore. Two deer showed up out of the woods. And again, since I like to write about emergent bodies, these deer seem to follow me around. They keep reminding me that something that's hidden wants to be known. So this poem comes from a 2018 book called Another City, and it's titled after a line from Rilke. Every angel is terrifying. There was the time one of the younger deer stepped into the hedges at the house that we called Homewood, and through an open window, he lowered the shale-colored muscular shoulders. His eyes met my eyes and pushed partway through. I thought it was to see who was alive in here, or to offer some encouragement with his aware, impassive face. May I stay heavy on this mind, I found myself requesting. May part of me remain behind these eyes, but it did not. The herd continued down their unmown road, and the deer at the window broke his gaze and turned and followed them. This was the start of some new work for me. It was fall. I had been trying to untangle all my questions. I wished that I was not myself. I never saw the angel after that. Time passed, nor did the herd return. I went back to what I had been doing all along, except that I could feel a certain focus, the concentration of a being standing, watching what I am. So, as Henry mentioned, this is my new book, Ice. It came out in August, and the week of its arrival, the Washington Post ran a story about a roundworm, a nematode, that had been discovered in a block of permafrost that was 46,000 years old. And the permafrost had come from a place called Yakutia in Siberia. Permafrost was melting, And as this parasite emerged, it came back to life after 46,000 years. And that's not all. It began to reproduce. So we have this being that existed at a time when Neanderthals were walking the earth, now existing and reproducing and even thriving in our world. And it kind of stands in between this transcendent past and the imminent future. It's also a kind of mourning image for me, because I think the whole reason that we know about it and we've witnessed this is because the permafrost is melting due to climate change. But for me, I wanted to hold in this book both a sense of wonder and a sense of mourning, and be right there at that hinge between the two for as many poems as I could. This worm is not the only animal that's appeared from under the permafrost. So like the bog bodies of Seamus Heaney in North, there are wolf heads, and there are woolly rhinos, and there are lemmings, and there are larks that have appeared as old as 50,000 years. And I became fascinated with them starting around 2020. So I'll just read a few of those poems and then arc into the last half of the book before I give the mic over to Dorianne. This is the title poem from the book. It's called Ice. And here's the little epigraph. The severed head of the world's first full-sized Pleistocene wolf was unearthed in the Abyysky district in the north of Yakutia on the shore of the Tirktyak River, tributary of the Indgirka. And that's from the Siberian Times from 2020. What I heard is that the locals searching for the mammoth tusk along the Tirktyak discovered instead the head of a wolf that had been frozen over 40,000 years ago. The tongue hung from its mouth. The teeth were terrible, but mostly there. The head alone was the size of a child. When the local people found the full-grown wolf head on the Tirktyak and pulled it like a molar from the soppy, gummy earth and hoisted it, the hardened points of fur cut through the gloves into their hands. On each side of the face, the eye sealed shut. When we read about the story of it together, those were the days when we would stay up all winter in the house writing poems in our icy rooms. You wanted a child. I don't know where that question got buried in my body. The wolf head lived on top of its body in the valley on the river, and we cannot know how the head got severed from the heart. The body may have dropped and collapsed into grass roots and larches, or it may have been cut from the wolf. But the head stayed intact, as it still is, as it feels that way now, the heft and the size of a child, cocked sideways in its question on the shoulders of the world. Here's another one from the first section of the book, which looks at these frozen bodies and is kind of my encounter with, even though I was never in Yakutia, these are my encounters with the photographs of these bodies. And as I said at another reading, in each of the poems, I like to hide something in ice. I'm hiding an allusion to another poem in almost every poem in this book. And this one has an allusion to Auden's Musée des Beaux-Arts, which is where the ship is passing Icarus because it had somewhere to get to at the end. Near Yakutia. Of all the animals who had their turn to remind me, this was my doing. I have taken things without impediment. The oldest was the rhino near Yakutia, found in her wool in August when the ice roads became passable. Dredged like a galleon, dry docked in mud, calloused as she wrecked slowly into their hands. then given a name and a body and a weight, a portion of the mass of the planet hanging under pounds of gaseous carbon, pluming into air. And she lay still drowning in what was once a riverbed. Wet tundra, around the time hands were inventing axes, implements of taking. Let me be taken. Let me know what falling is. Let her thwart my life. This baby, this whelp of the herd, who had somewhere to get to, who had somewhere to get to, who had somewhere to get to, and propelled herself like the ship that passed over Icarus when the sky began to clear, and the axeman axed, and the ice broke in pieces, unhanding everything. Thanks for the snaps. This is the third and last of these ice body poems, and it is about a 50,000-year-old lark, which is perfectly preserved except for one Christ-like wound in its abdomen. But for 50,000 years lay under this permafrost, and in 2020 rose to the surface and was found by a child and believed to be a bird that had just fallen out of the sky. This is called Reading the Light Surrounding the Lark, and it's the place where I kind of turn and begin to look at the frozen bodies in me from childhood, from young adulthood, from infancy, bodies that are frozen in their space, thinking that they're the real body, and which appear every once in a while in reactivity. So again, this is called Reading the Light Surrounding the Lark. What you're witnessing is not merely residue of ice. They chiseled it apart by toothbrush, for the permafrost had coated it as plaque. But it was not a tooth. It was not rotten. It was perched underground in its negative tree. It was a lark, and it has always been a lark. Then the underground cloud cracked, melted, and the lark fell upward to our world. To read the light around the lark, imagine you have chiseled part of you away, an old part, at the beginning of a succession of your childhood bodies. You fall upward from your previous body out of the melting ice. And when you look back on each body, if you will brush them carefully, if you will chisel what is not you carefully, then you'll know that each is still bewildered and desiring to stay in what it must believe is the only world, the one that's safe, the real one. So there's a line in Rick Barrett's The Galleons that he quotes from someone else. It's such a moving and such a pertinent line. It's merely, research is mourning. I see it in the eyes of my students. They get all of this information. They feel this mounting anxiety because their lives are really about a flow of research coming into them and passing through them. And it's unstoppable. But the more they know, the more this look of mourning passes over their faces. They know about troop movements happening right now. They know about hostages. They know about attacks and retaliations. And they're sitting in a classroom in Washington, D.C. at the same time. So this challenge of writing about the mourning that is the result of all of this information that's flowing through us all the time made its way inevitably, I think, into the work that I'm doing and that we're all doing now. And for me, I had to think about what was melting the ice of those bodies, those bodies that kind of rise to the surface when I feel that fear and when I feel that anxiety. What is it that melts that ice for me? What is it that brings those bodies into an emergent state. And for me, it was poetry. It's always been poetry. So the third part of this book is about that subtle thawing out. And it has to do with me going to locations where certain poems were written and writing about the poet writing their poem there. So I'll just read a couple of those in closing. This is called Reading Emily Dickinson in Amherst, Massachusetts. I know how it feels to live in a small leaden room with only snakes and birds as consolation. I know how to imagine death by falling through stories of floorboards, like a poem flutters through molecules, air, and time. It never lands in the yard. The trick is not to die while dreaming of death. That's why the circle of doors and windows here remain open. A little. That's why the poems seem often to end on slant rhymes and dashes. That's why the hawthorn cone is never quite in full bloom, but almost. I too come here respectfully. I bow halfway at thresholds. I know how to wait at a completely empty window, holding out my hands. And the last poem that I'll read has a little story that goes along with it, and it's about my first visit to Mary Oliver's house. Mary and I became friends 23 years ago and stayed in close touch and became very close by the end of her life in 2019. And my first visit to her to Provincetown involved me with a little piece of paper with an address that I thought was hers on it, driving up Commercial Street and pulling up to this address, which was the wrong address, and walking up to the door and knocking on this door on the wrong side of Commercial Street, on the opposite side that Mary lived. This random door, and someone answering, and me saying, "Is this Mary Oliver's house?" And them looking at me strangely and saying, "No, this was Stanley Kunitz's house." And me having a conversation with them in the threshold of the door saying, "Well, this is what happened, and I can't believe that I'm here. I love Stanley Kunitz." And they invited me in. Stanley Kunitz had just died the previous year. So here I am, with access to the Grail Palace. And I walk in and go into the garden, the famous garden, and this caretaker plucked me a little hollyhock that I put into my pocket. And it took me maybe 20 years to write the poem about it. And in the poem, I imagine that it's Stanley Kunitz himself who's offering me this hollyhock. Basically a poem about how no matter how hard we try to screw it up, sometimes things bloom anyway. So this is the poem. It's called A Hollyhock That Once Belonged to Stanley Kunitz. Later that week, I found it in my right side pocket. It had begun to bloom, blue, tissue thin. To the bottle of carbolic acid went your father. To brain plaque, the weed of forgetfulness, went your mother. Still you felt a fondness for the natural thing. You loved even the mulch and the flower of the mallow family, hollyhock. Come in, you said. From one specimen of the garden, you cut me a sprig, which I pocketed. Taken from light, from you, from its princedom, a small Gautama. Then I forgot it was there, down there in the dark, doing its precise work anyway. Thank you all. Henry, thanks again for that wonderful introduction. You're a prince.
David, it's always great to hear you read your poems, and tonight's no exception. Thank you very much. Now I am honored to introduce Dorianne Laux. I've read the words prize-winning poet next to her name. Indeed, that rings true. Dorianne's 6th collection, Only as the Day is Long, New and Selected Poems, was named a finalist for the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Her 5th collection, The Book of Men, was awarded the Patterson Prize. Her 4th book of poems, Facts About the Moon, won the Oregon Book Award and was shortlisted for the Lenore Marshall Poetry Prize. Dorianne is the author of Awake, What We Carry, a finalist for the National Book Critics Award. Her next collection, Life on Earth, will be released in January 2024. She is the co-author of the celebrated text, The Poet's Companion, a guide to the pleasure of writing poetry. Can everybody see it? That's the staple of the Poets Library, I'm pretty sure. Anyway, tonight she's reading from her 6th collection, Only as the Day is Long. And I believe she'll give us a sneak listen rather, to her forthcoming collection, Life on Earth. Her works are accessible, down to earth, and brutally honest in presenting grief, trauma, sensuality, and tenderness. Only as the Day is Long includes 20 odes to her mother. In the title poem, Only as the Day is Long, she uses sparse language to give a picture of her mother who is dying. Even just one word, boozy, lets the reader imagine who she was and what their relationship must have been like. And I quote, "Her atoms are out there, circling the earth, minus her happiness, minus her grief. Her boozy atoms, her saltines and crackers and tea, but not her piano concerto atoms. Her atoms of laughter and cruelty, her atoms of lies and lilies along the driveway." The first poem in this collection is Two Views of My Sister from her book Awake. The epigraph reads, "If a writer is silent, he is dying." Dorianne is anything but silent. Her poems scream from the page. Dad shakes his belt in her face. A strip of skin has peeled from her shoulder. There are snake lines across her thighs, a perfect curl around her neck. She looks through him as if she could see behind his head. Please join me in welcoming Dorianne Laux.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Renee. And thank you, Henry. And thank you, David. That was spectacular. I love your idea of unearthing bodies from ice, of all things, you know. So you see through to the body before it's resurrected. Sort of that one about the lark. It's just amazing, right? With that kind of Christ cross in it. So actually, I'm not going to read from Only as the Day is Long, because although, you know, it was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, I've moved on, and I'm going to take a second jab at it. And so I wrote another book, and it's called Life on Earth. And I wish you could see this little baby here. This little baby is just spectacular. And I'm going to read poems from this new book, which, as Renee said, will be out in January. And the very first poem in the book is called "In Any Event." Something my mother used to say a lot. Well, in any event, you know. But this is maybe more global or universal in nature, as in the universe. In any event, if we are fractured like stars, bred to shine in every direction, through any dimension, billions of years since and hence. I shall not lament the human, Not yet. There is something more to come. Our hearts a gold mine, not yet plumbed, an uncharted sea. Nothing is gone forever. If we came from dust and will return to dust, then we can find our way into anything. What we are capable of is not yet known, and I praise us now in advance. The next one is easy because it's the next poem in the book, and it's for my mother. Once again, I mean, only as the day is long, as you said, Renee, have 20 new poems about my mother and her death and my memories of her. They are odes. And this is another ode to my mother because I've written about my mother all my life. She's my muse. And I'm sure I will continue to write poems about her until the day I die. So this is called Spirit Level, and probably most of you know the little instrument that you use to measure a board or a 2x4 so that you can build a house or a table or a chair. And so the image of that should be in your minds. Spirit level. Gary Snyder says, and this is the epigraph, when making an axe handle, the pattern is not far off. Of course, this assumes that you're making an axe handle with an axe. I don't know how many people have carved an axe handle with an axe, but clearly Gary has. My mother was either horizontal on the couch or vertical, a plumb line from her spine to the top of her head to the ceiling that spins when she drinks. Alcohol and an air bubble trapped, sealed, and fixed inside her. Her face carved from wood, a tear gliding slowly down the curve of her cheek. My mother was once a spirit in the world. Once she breathed for me, above me, beside me, behind me. Now I feel her warm breath on my neck summer nights, peering over my shoulder as I write every poem, whispering, "Let me in." I let her in. I remember every time she picked me up or set me down, put me to bed or woke me from dreams. And now I see how my whole life has been a dream, one she built for me from the ground up. Her daughter, my mother, the axe, beautiful tool with which she shaped me. A house much like the one she lived in, but smaller, fewer rooms, a tiny, unusable attic, and a cluttered basement. I let her in, like she let me in. She became my carpenter, stonemason, and bricklayer, piling me up, cell by cell, the blade that shaped my legs, my arms, my surveyor, millwright. She used herself as a template, her genes tough, her organs elastic, her eyes and nose, forehead and mouth. And when my body, from which her body, from which my body was made, was slipped into the hot retort, I burned too. She refused the beveled casket, the oiled mahogany box, last drawer for the dead, wanted only the fury of fire, the blue-white flames unmaking her with their licking tongues. House her grandmother built, and her grandmother before her, all of them giving what they had been given, the hardwood floors, store cases and banisters, their deepest cupboards, their heavy doors flung wide so the breeze I would be could blow through. The next poem is about my brother who died when I was very young, and it's called Winter Brother. These nights I walk out and look up at Orion, my winter brother, spellbound each time I trace him to wholeness, from the star on his right shoulder to the star on his left, down to form his torso, lower down his little skirt. I know his right hand holds a club, but I replace it with two splayed arrows pointing up. In his left, a lion's pelt that for me becomes a bow, from hunter to archer, just like that. And why not? Whoever made him up is lost to history's shimmering distance, and I'm here now in my dark backyard, a splash of ghost sibling lilies glowing at my feet. I like to think he's my older brother who died far from home on a lonely road, his broken body found in a muddy gutter, swollen with rain. That's how it is down here on the death-packed earth, where nothing is eternal. The body's buried haunch to haunch beneath the indifferent dirt. I remember his handwriting on a postcard, the lines squashed between the address and the card's cut edge. I miss you. I love you. I saw some sights today you wouldn't believe. On the other side, a wall of etched bricks, a statue of Karl Marx's fat head, his beard of gray stone. When he died, I felt alone. Some part of me went cold, some echo following me like a false star. So I lifted my brother into the sky, where I could ride on his belt as he strode over the 7 continents, sharing an eyedropper of water between us. And this is another poem from my mother, inspired by the ubiquitous Bisquick. I don't know how many of you remember having that in your cupboard, but I am never without a box. Bisquick. My mother could whip anything up from a box of the stuff. A casserole, a cobbler, Mississippi pot roast with cheese biscuits, chicken and dumplings, or fried chicken, the skin crispy as her cookies and pie crust. It seemed the oven was always on, the dial pointing to home, where we'd run back to from wherever we had gotten to, leaving footprints on her clean floor, mud or sand, or the water that thundered from the hose in summer. She served the silky gravy in a scratched glass boat, poured it like good fortune over our mashed potatoes, all of us having dug out our wonder craters to receive it. And sometimes I came home early just to smell the air, scented with mingled spices, see the banners of flour the pan left on the counter when she lifted it, the bottom blackened by years of burned butter. We'd wake to pancakes in the cast iron skillet, and it seemed she'd never slept, never stopped, eggs cracking open, spilling each whole yellow globe into the blue bowl. What were we waiting for but to see her at the sink, her long bare feet on the cool tiles, just an ordinary woman made of flint and roses, her black hair tied back with a drugstore scarf. But this one is for Marilyn Monroe, and it's called Wild Horses. And there's a quote from the Rolling Stones, and it is, "I watched you suffer a dull, aching pain." Mustangs were bred for stamina, little knock-kneed engines. In the Misfits, they were bred for dog food. Marilyn Monroe was even more beautiful in black and white. When she says she can hear her skin against her clothes, we believe her, are with her in the desert. The Mustangs crest the small hill and appear, wild-eyed, kicking up dust and sagebrush. She watches the men hobble their legs, preparing them for the gunshot, the daggers, the grave. Tin cans of dog food in the cupboards of every home in America. Their liquid eyes ageless, their big hearts peeling like cold bronze bells. This is one roll not centered around her breasts, her chest cut open, nails in her heart. Not a joke, not a paradise for fantasy. It was her final movie. They found her at home, face down, holding on to a phone. She was born in June and died in August, near the end of summer. White pills spilled on the rug. She always said she liked to sleep. The men who surrounded her eased their glasses down over their noses to look at her in the gymnasiums of their dreams, unable to raise one barbell, one sad cloud. Suddenly tired of their own excuses, one held her feet, one held her shoulders, and they lifted her up. This is called I Dare You. It's autumn, and we're getting rid of books, getting ready to retire, to move someplace smaller, more manageable. We're living in reverse, age-proofing the new house. Nothing on the floors to trip over, no hindrances to the slowed mechanisms of our bodies. A small table for two. Our world is shrinking. Our closets mostly empty. Gone the tight skirts and dancing shoes, the bells and whistles. Now, when someone comes to visit and admires our complete works of Shakespeare, the hawk feather in the open dictionary, the iron angel on a shelf, we say take them. This is the most important time of all, the age of divestment. Knowing what we leave behind is like the fragrance of blossoming trees that grow stronger after you've passed them, breathing them in for a moment before breathing them out. An ordinary Tuesday, when one of you says, I dare you, and the other one just laughs. I decided, what's one more poem? I mean, once you've used a cliche, why not just go for broke, right? I love the story of Li Young Lee saying, I am so glad I didn't realize that a rose was a symbol for love before I wrote my book, Rose, or I never would have done it, and it's the same kind of thing. I mean, I just forgot that it was a cliche, and luckily I keep forgetting. So Moon Ghazal. I can't remember the first time I saw it. Seems like it was always there, even with me in the womb, the moon. It must have been night above the ocean, making a path on the waves, gilded invitation, the parchment moon. Or the day moon, see-through-y wafer over the desert, caught in the arms of saguaro, thin-skinned, heart-stuck moon. Blue as new milk, aquarium water, Mexican tiles, blue as fingertips in the cold, nail beds, quick blue arcs, half moons. How I felt when my first grown-up boy, I saw him, round-eyed, all sinew and muscle, his calves, his biceps, plump as moons. Buttons, doorknobs, volleyballs, clocks, egg yolks, orange slice, violet iris, our planet a pupil, mote in the eye of the moon. The cells inside me, splitting and splitting, worm of the fetus, tadpole, the glazed orb of the eye, my belly taut as the moon. The blood-streaked moon of her head pushing through, moons of the faces above me, urging me, pulling, promising the moon. There are earthquakes on the moon, not geologically dead, still acting like a planet, upheaval, turmoil, shaking its head, the moon. When I see the earth of you, I still feel moonquakes, even now, after so many moons. My round breasts swoon, your fingertips, small moons. I'll end with the title poem of the book, called Life on Earth. I always have a very difficult time putting books together after if they're titled. I somehow feel like, oh, well, with the title, this poem doesn't fit, or I should save this for another book, or, and it's just, or I get all the poems together and then I can't think of a title. And in this case, I got the title Life on Earth, and it was such a relief because I thought it won't matter how I put this book together because any poem I write is going to work with life on Earth, because what isn't life on Earth? Even when I'm talking about the moon, it's from my place here on Earth. It's from my life here on Earth. Life on Earth. The odds are we should never have been born. Not one of us. Not 1 in 400 trillion to be exact. Only one among the 250 million released in a flood of semen that glides like a glassine limousine filled with tadpoles of possible people, one of whom may or may not be you. A being made of water and blood, a creature with eyeballs and limbs that end in fists, a you with all your particular perfumes, the chords of your sinewy legs singing as they form, your organs humming and buzzing with new life, moonbeams lighting up your brain's gray coils, the exquisite hills of your face, the human toy your mother longs for, your father yearns to hold, the unmistakable you who will take your first breath, your first step, bang a copper pot with a wooden spoon, trace the lichen growing on a boulder you climb to see the wild expanse of a field, the one whose heart will yield to the yellow forsythia, named after William Forsythe, not the American actor with piercing blue eyes, but the Scottish botanist who discovered the buttery bells on a highland hillside, blooming to beat the band, zigzagging down an unknown Scottish slope. And those are only a few of the things you will one day know, slowly chipping away at your ignorance and doubt. You who were born from ashes and will return to ash. When you think you might be through with this body and soul, look down at an anthill or up at the stars. Remember your gambler chances, the bounty of good luck you were born for. So thank all of you. I love seeing your little hands wiggling and your fingers.
Thank you, Dorianne. Karen, do we have time for a question?
We have time for something quick.
Okay, quick.
I
right.
wanted to say that I hear a lot of legacy in both of your work, and that this is important. David, your legacy was in ice, but it was also in children. The question of the child in the poem with the wolf head, the legacy of all the writers that you write. And Dorianne, you had many poems, particularly toward the end, where we were talking about aging and the legacy of, what are you going to leave behind? So what would you like for this reading to represent in your legacy, and what should we take away from this as the most important thing? Dorianne, you first.
This reading is a legacy. Well, all poetry readings are legacies, you know. I mean, they're bequeathing their listeners with, you know, so much, right? Visions and ideas and emotions and, you know, all of the things that are ephemeral that we can't take with us, but that we do take with us, that are more important than the physical objects, you know. And so poetry is a legacy of the human desire, you know, to connect, to move in and through each other before we leave, you know, this incredible paradise that we've been gifted with. And it's for me, it's the best part of this paradise, language and the ability to communicate.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dorianne. David, what do you say?
I was afraid you were going to turn it over to me after that. Okay, well, what can I say? That what is what's passing through my mind now is that the word legacy itself is related to the word reading, like legible. And so there is a way that we're all learning to read the world if we learn to read poetry closely, to listen to poetry, and to write it. For me, writing poetry and learning from all of the poets who were around me as I came up into this world, Dorianne being one of them. I remember reading one of your poems in American Poetry Review. It must have been 1993 or something like that. And I just...
Never say the year.
What's that?
Never say the year.
Never say the year. Well, I was there too. So
it's gotten to the point where people say, oh yes, I read your poems from a book that my grandmother had. Like,
somehow I knew you were going to say that, but honestly, having your poems around me, and Lee Young Lee, who you mentioned too, that book was so important to me. All those early BOA books with Lucille Clifton, and these books were they were around me all the time, and I wasn't reading them 24/7, but I somehow, like a sponge, learned how to read poetry, and by reading poetry, reading deeply into the world. So this is just another step in that lineage, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both. I often make people uncomfortable with the questions, but I think you both did a great job. I turn it over to you, Renee, to close. Thank you.
Karen, I didn't see any discomfort, but once again, we've come to the end of our program. And on behalf of Cafe Muse, all of us, I want to thank our poets, David Keplinger and Dorianne Laux. They shared their poems with the legacy that they're talking about, and Karen asked about, that dig into the past and into what's left behind and what they bring forth and leave behind. Again, enthusiastically, I encourage you to go to the links in the chat and purchase David and Dorianne's poems. And there's also a link to donate to Cafe Muse Literary Salon. Thank you, Michael Davis, for your beautiful classical guitar in the opening. Henry and I thank all of our co-host volunteers who worked with us behind the scene, making this evening possible. Ellen Cole, Majda Gama, Luther Jett, Claire McGough, and of course, Cafe Muse's founder, Karen Alanier. Please join us for our next reading on December 4th, 2023. It's our last one of the year, featuring Nancy Naomi Carlson, hosting an anthology of Jewish poets. In between readings, you can check us out on Facebook, YouTube, and our website. On behalf of Cafe Muse, thank you all for joining us tonight. We wouldn't be here without you. We wish you a happy Thanksgiving. Stay safe, be well, and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Renee.